Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into new approaches to America's housing crisis. I'm Reed Wilson, the founder and editor of Pluribus News, and I'm excited to have this conversation about, oh, I love the cat, and this important issue that I know is a big part of the conversation for lawmakers all across the country. I want to thank our sponsors, the National Association of Home Builders, for making this event possible. And I want to welcome our two special guests. Let's start with Oregon Representative Maxine Dexter, a Democrat serving her second full term in the legislature, where she chairs the Interim Committee on Housing and Homelessness. And we're joined by Utah Representative Robert Spendlove, a Republican serving his fifth term in the legislature, where he's the vice chair of the Executive Appropriations Committee. And with that, I'm going to turn this conversation over to my colleague, Sophie Quinton. Sophie, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Reed. Like Reed, I'm excited for our conversation today. One thing that we've been following closely here at Pluribus is what a hot topic housing has been this year for state legislatures across the country. Lawmakers are still watching those home prices kind of stay above the level many people can afford. Rents are still high. We now have this added complication of rising interest rates that have made home buying even more expensive and home building more expensive. But as we'll hear from our conversation today, there's really no one way to solve this problem, and states are taking a number of different approaches to try to address the housing crisis. So I wanted to start with you, Representative Dexter, because I know that making housing more affordable and reducing homelessness has been a top priority for Oregon lawmakers for several years now. Oregon passed its biennial budget last year, but that didn't stop Governor Kotek from proposing major new spending on housing this year. I know the legislature ended up passing kind of a slimmed down version of her plan. Can you tell us what made it into the final sort of omnibus housing law?
Yeah, thanks so much for having this conversation. I agree. It's an issue on everyone's mind across the country right now. So indeed, the governor and the legislature wanted to address what clearly is on everyone's mind, that we need more housing, we need it to be affordable, and we need to protect the affordable housing that we have, preserve it, while we're also keeping people in their housing. So the package that we had really was intended to address all of the different issues. We needed some land. One of the governor's most controversial proposals was a UGB, a urban growth boundary expansion, and Oregon has a uniquely focused urban growth boundary that really has a process for expanding, and it's something that Oregonians really value in a lot of ways. It's part of how we have kept this the suburban sprawl from happening here. Others would argue that it kept us from building the land or the housing that we needed. So she advocated, and we did pass a one-time urban growth boundary expansion to allow local jurisdictions to expand to allow for more housing. We also created a housing accountability and production office, so a central office that's really going to help facilitate statewide codes and making sure that permitting is expedited and really working across the state. So trying to centralize some of the challenges that we continue to see. We had design and development adjustments that builders can have, and that is in the law, so that, you know, for temporary design and mandatory design and development adjustments, that things like parking minimums and whatnot were waived so that we could build the housing that we need. Sorry, my son's getting ready to go to school. We also invested in infrastructure. So one of the major costs for development is the infrastructure. Like, we have property tax caps that keep us from being able to invest in the water and the sewer and the road development that we need to have buildable land. So that was a huge component. It was $188 million in this last session. And then we had a homelessness and housing support portion, which was looking at recovery housing and updating housing so that it's healthier and more climate resilient. So heating and cooling. We have tenant education and rental assistance and shelter investments. So really trying to thread that needle. And then one of the biggest, most innovative things we did was a a investment for middle housing, so that workforce housing, a renewable loan fund that will close the gap for those production, the funding where you can't get a project to pencil out because that last bit of funding that's available for 60 to 120% area median income, or area median AMI. Sorry, all of a sudden I was like acronyms, trying not to use them, and then was blanking there.
Well, it's a very, wide-ranging bill, and as I said at the beginning, it's kind of coming on top of major investments Oregon made last session. I mean, was there anything in the bill that lawmakers felt was really important to include this year, either because it builds on what happened last year or because it's something the state hasn't really invested in before, like the infrastructure funding piece, for instance? Had Oregon put money into sort of helping cities support new housing before, or was that something new in this package?
It's certainly something that we've done, line item allocations and appropriations. There's always projects that are advocating for this, but this was a really broad reaching throughout the state, and we took requests for consideration from everywhere and then really prioritized those and created investments where the maximal amount of housing would come as a result of those investments. So really looking at the return on investment. That was a new way of doing it, and it was a bit of a process, and really focused on water and sewer, because that oftentimes is the thing that people can't afford at the local level to invest in. So that was new. Healthy homes, that investment for lower income families, when we had our heat dome event here, where we had over 60 people die as a result in our state of just not having access to cooling in this, when we had several days over 100 degrees here, which, for parts of the country that's not a problem, but many homes in Oregon don't have air conditioning. It was never hot enough here for the older homes to have it, and that has really created an issue. So we invested 15 more million than we did last session to try to upgrade heat pumps and whatnot across the spectrum. And so that was an innovation in the last 2 biennia that we've been doing. I think the only other thing is recovery housing. We really are seeing a lot of folks across the nation have seen the addiction issues that we're having in Oregon. I don't think it's unique to us, but really focusing on how do you create those restorative spaces where people can be in recovery and have housing at the same time, and not necessarily shelters being the most restorative places for people to deal with their addictions in. So investing in places for people to be where they have the support they need.
Yeah, I think addressing those addiction issues and the sort of link with homelessness, we need to do a whole other panel on that, because there's so much to dive into there. I want to turn to Representative Spendlove now, because I know Governor Cox in Utah also put forward kind of an ambitious housing plan this session, but lawmakers ended up kind of scrapping it because money was tight. It was a little bit difficult to get some of that done. I know the governor had initially proposed spending, I think it was about 150 million, focused on spurring construction of smaller, quote unquote, starter homes in the state. But I know Representative Spendlove, you worked with his team when it turned out that there wasn't really, money available to pay for what he had initially asked for, on a totally different approach to financing starter homes that could be the first of its kind. Can you walk us through kind of what you ended up coming up with?
Sure, and thanks for having me today. It's fun to be able to kind of talk through these issues and see different examples. And to me, this is really an example of how we can come together and find these unique solutions. Just like you said, the governor had an ambitious plan using direct appropriation to try to help the issue of housing and building new houses. But when we started to work with them, we said, okay, we need to think outside the box and figure out a different way to accomplish these same policy objectives. And so, and kind of what are we trying to address? And so I want to, kind of dig deep into one specific bill, which is the one that I sponsored. It's House Bill 572. And And so, what we're trying to address, so if you kind of think about the different parts, so I'm an economist, and so I think about supply and demand, right? And so a lot of recent legislation around the country is really trying to focus on that demand side, or incentivizing individuals, or giving people assistance with buying a home. But the purpose of this bill is to really address the supply side of housing. And so, we know with mortgage rates going up so dramatically, then you couple that with the banking crisis a year ago, with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and a few other banks. It's really kind of squeezed the ability to fund new construction. And you kind of couple that, where we looked at the share of existing mortgages that have a rate of 4% or lower. And in Utah, that number is about 72%. So 72% of people have a mortgage below 4% in Utah. And what that means is they're never going to move. And so the only solution is to build new homes. So, we kind of know the problem. But when you look at the response to the current environment, we're not seeing an increasing building permit activity. In fact, what we've seen recently is a drop in permit activity, where in 2023, we had that building permits dropping pretty dramatically. And the forecast is that without any kind of intervention, we'll continue to see building activity going down. And so the idea was to, one other part of the problem is banks. So banks don't have access to funds like they have in the past, and builders therefore don't have access to funds from banks either. And so that's the kind of area that we're trying to address. So what we've got in Utah, and I believe every state has this, but we've got what we call the Public Treasure Investment Fund. It's the bank account for the state of Utah. And that fund has about $30 billion in it. What's interesting is just a few years ago, that PTIF had about $20 billion. So it's increased dramatically. The size of that state bank account has increased dramatically in the last few years. And our thought is, so most of that money is going to other areas. It's going to, our Money Management Act requires that they invest in the assets that will have the highest return possible. And so what we had to do is we tweaked our Money Management Act to carve out a small amount of that 30 billion, specifically $300 million, to be able to use to increase that liquidity in banks that they can then lend to builders. And so, the way that would work is a builder with a qualified project. And, what's a qualified project? Well, 60% of the homes have to be below the median home price for the county. And we've defined that as roughly 80% of the county median. So 60% of the homes have to be defined as affordable. And then the homes that are built have a 5-year deed restriction for owner occupancy. So, you can't just have a big investor come in and buy up all these homes. It has to be individuals living in those homes. So if they have a qualified housing project, the builder goes to a financial institution, a bank or a credit union that is participating in the program, and requests a loan for that project. The bank then goes to the Utah Home Investment Program through our treasurer's office and applies to access some of that $300 million. And the PTIF money, or the money from the state, can reimburse up to 100% of that cost to the bank. So then the bank, let's just say it's a $10 million project, they come to the PTIF, applies for that 10 million, they then lend that out to the builder. The benefit to the bank is, so this is a loan, they have to repay that loan to the state, but they can repay it at a lower rate than the prevailing rate. So right now, the Fed funds rate is about, sorry, the federal funds rate, which is kind of our main interest rate, is at about 5.4%. They could, the bank will be able to repay that at Fed funds rate minus 200 basis points, or 2% lower. But then they can charge up to 3.5% above that rate. So they still get their spread, they get a little bit of a benefit. The builder has access to capital. And then our result is we have affordable homes being built. So it really is. Oh, and then one other thing that we're doing, we want to get this out really fast. And so the program goes live on May 1st. We'll be pushing money out until December 31st of 2025. So roughly 20 months for the money to go out. And then all the deposits have to be returned back to the state by July 1st of 2027. So it's the total time period of this is 3 years. And, we did that for a number of reasons. We didn't want to have that $300 million out for too long. We also want to be able to measure the results, see if this really accomplishes our objectives. If it's successful, what I'd love to see is that $300 million runs out the door really quick and is so successful that we have that turnaround in not just overall building activity, but affordable building. And then we can kind of reassess and do more, do more in the future.
Yeah, I think this idea in Utah is kind of ingenious, and it's something that, potentially other states could look at as well. I know that Governor Cox's office has talked to folks in other states about this already. Utah isn't the only state that's sitting on, a huge bank balance, essentially coming out of the pandemic with all of this, federal aid and surpluses and interest growing on top of that. But I think, it will be interesting to see if builders are able to actually make these projects work. When I talked to some home builders in the state, they were sort of divided on whether they were going to be able to, make these, build these projects, price them a little bit lower, targeted towards those folks with the lower median income. And if the money they'd save on kind of this lower interest capital from the state would be enough to make profit on the project, essentially. I don't know, Representative Spenlove, what you've been hearing from developers so far. I mean, when I wrote about this a few weeks ago, I don't think there were any projects that were really at the front of the line or folks saying, hey, I actually have something. But I'm wondering if since then any developers are stepping forward and saying, actually, we do have a project that this could really work for.
Yeah, and that's the big question is, will it be successful? Will people be interested? And it's too soon to tell yet because the program isn't going, but we have had a lot of interest, a lot of questions. I just met with a builder earlier this week that's trying to make this work. And part of our problem, so the median home price in America is about $342,000. The median home price in Utah is now $500,000. And so, how do you define affordable? But you kind of have to define it according to the median. And so that's why we're doing it county by county. If you look at Park City, 80% of the median is $800,000. But a more rural area, we might be able to get, or even ex-urban area, on the outskirts, we might be able to get something for in the range of $350,000 to $450,000, which is still too expensive, but we're trying to push down that cost curve a little bit. We have heard some projects, some early estimates that that some builders will be able to find the way to do this. And I'll tell you that this is just one part of it. Another part is we've got to kind of be reassessing what an affordable home looks like. Does it need to be 3,000 square feet with a 3-car garage? Probably not. It probably needs to be something like 1,100 square feet with a carport. But so that's part of this adjustment to this new rate environment. For the last 2 years, everyone's been waiting for interest rates to go back down, but I don't think they are. So I think now, rather than waiting for things to get better, we have to adjust to how things are now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that that focus on, how do we incentivize smaller units really fits in with, some of the zoning reforms that states have been trying to push. I know in both of your states and really nationally, this idea of how do we make it possible for developers to build townhomes, to build accessory dwelling units, to build these kind of smaller units that can be more affordable. I know Representative Dexter, there's been a lot of activity along those lines in Oregon, and I'm wondering if you have any sense of whether, some of the work the state has done to allow for those kind of smaller units to get built is working. I mean, are you hearing from cities that cities are starting to see more duplexes get built, or is it again kind of too soon to see how some of those zoning reforms might be playing out?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. And it is a critical issue. I think we see places where this is practice or common practice. Chicago has a significant amount of affordable housing because when a single family home is sold, a lot of times the expectation is that multi-dwelling units are going to be built on that property. And that has not been the practice in Oregon in a lot of ways. There's been historic districts and ways to protect the character of our communities, and that ends up being a NIMBY policy. So what we did, as many states, as you said, are doing, is created the opportunity for up to a quadplex on any single family home plot. And that is happening. It is absolutely starting to be more common. The challenge, as Representative Svenlev was just talking about, is it's expensive and the funding isn't there. So if you're a mom and pop developer who is trying to build a 4-unit community or housing structure on a single family home unit plot, there's no gap to closing that funding issue, and there's no way to do that for a single developer. The codes and the permits, and there's so many challenges, especially in the city of Portland. Like our jurisdiction has not been known for being builder friendly, and that's really those barriers create even more challenges, because the longer you have to have a loan out, the more interest you're paying, the more upfront costs. You've already invested tremendous amounts of money, and by the time you actually sell the unit. So that's part of what we're trying to do with it. It's a really interesting dynamic that we had. A renewable loan fund is similar in principle to what Representative Spenlove is talking about, using some of those cash reserves and then renewing them. That is meant to help incentivize those 60 to 120% area median income developments. And to exactly that point, these are not going to be 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom homes. These are going to be, hopefully smaller units that people can still build generational wealth with.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how some of these reforms play out, because it, sort of rebuilding our built environment takes time, right? It's going to be a while before we kind of, know what the best strategies are. But it's certainly interesting to see kind of even in early stages what is kind of getting, what seems to be sort of inspiring new projects and what seems to be gaining traction. I wanted to close by asking both of you kind of what is next for housing in your state. I mean, Oregon and Utah have both wrapped up their legislative sessions for the year. I know it's early to be thinking about next year, but I know lawmakers are always thinking about next year. So I wanted, maybe we could start with you, Representative Dexter. I mean, thinking about what Oregon has done in recent years, what is still to do to help address the housing crisis and maybe increase the supply of housing in your state?
Yeah, I know we're not alone. We just had the highest number of retirements across the nation at age 65, or the highest number ever of people turning 65. We have the gray tsunami coming, or the silver tsunami, as people are calling it. We are looking at how do we build communities where people can age in place. The challenges around retirement living and skilled nursing and all these things are really top of mind. And we have the most rapidly growing unhoused elderly population that we've seen. And it's absolutely an issue that's going to only get worse. So we are really looking at how do we build, communities where people can have the support they need as they become more medically fragile or complex, and can afford to stay. retirement living is expensive and is not accessible for an enormous number of people. So we're talking about for Medicaid, whether we get rid of the requirements that you sell your home and have no assets, but to be able to receive Medicaid, because we also see that means that some multi-generational families lose their housing because it's their mother or grandmother who owns the home and they have to sell it to be able to get into skilled nursing. So we are really trying to crack that nut of how do you create opportunities for people to age in place, looking at multi-generational housing production, really trying to not just think about single family homes as being what we need to create, but opportunities for people to live in community and still have stability.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that, that question of Medicaid requirements and what it takes for folks to get into skilled nursing, that is such a challenge for so many people. So it'll be interesting to stay tuned into that conversation in Oregon. And Representative Spendlove, what about you? What are lawmakers thinking about as you look at kind of the ongoing housing challenges in Utah?
Yeah, and I love what Representative Dexter said about the urban growth boundary, because if you've ever been to Utah, we have a lot of urban growth boundaries, but we call those the mountains, and so it really limits our ability to build and where we can build, and so and in Utah specifically, you couple the mountains with the water. And those are our biggest limitations on how we grow. And so we've got to be, one of the things we're really pushing is, kind of in the new environment, we probably can't continue to be building, a third of an acre or houses on a third of an acre with, a huge Kentucky bluegrass lawns. And so we've got to be getting more house-wise in what we're building and more water-wise to be able to plan for the future. So we're going to be, really working, kind of educating people on the importance of density and the importance of how we take advantage of our resources in the best way. There's going to be a lot of discussions with local government about the right mix of zoning, the right way to be growing mixed use housing, where we kind of have a mix of commercial and residential, trying to create more walkable communities. But those are all conversations that are ongoing. We've been having those for a while, but I think with this kind of housing crisis that we're running into, and with the rest of the nation, we've really got to start thinking creatively about how we can address it. And so some of the things that we may have dismissed in the past, we're now going to be coming back and saying, is this something that we need to be doing?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I hear a lot when I talk to lawmakers is this idea of like the sense of crisis is getting folks on the same page, sometimes for the first time ever, cities, state folks, environmental groups, tenants' rights groups, developers, you name it. I mean, I don't know if there are any like interesting examples of that for your states, or like weird new coalitions that have emerged that are sort of been forged by this sense of crisis. It's just been interesting to watch that evolve, especially in the past couple of years.
Yeah, and I just remember, I think it was Rahm Emanuel that said, never let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
So there are some great opportunities now.
Yeah.
Somebody just knocked on our door, so my dog's barking a lot. But we actually saw that in this last session or in the 2023 session, when we were adjusting our urban growth boundaries and really trying to incentivize density, but also lowering the thresholds for building housing. And housing in our urban growth boundary bill from 1973, housing was goal 10 out of many other goals of preservation. And we really were trying to move housing production to the top. And we had our environmental groups at the table recognizing that it is absolutely incumbent that we build the housing people need. And so whether you're an environmentalist or an developer, we all were in agreement, and what the goals was to preserve our natural resources, much in the same way Representative Spendlove was saying. We are very well aware that drought is going to become more and more of an issue. And so how do we build in a dense informed way, but also as quickly as possible, because we have a humanitarian crisis on our streets right now too.
Right, right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I want to be respectful of your time. I know you have places to be and things to do. So I'm going to wrap things up and kick it back to Reed. I think he and I are going to hang out and chat a little bit longer.
Yeah, thank you both to Representative Spendlove and Representative Dexter. We really appreciate it. I love this. I love this type of conversation. I thought we learned a lot about both states, and hopefully a lot of people are going to take away some lessons for what they can do in their own states. So, Sophie, I want to turn to you now, because you've been covering so much housing, housing for us all year. I mean, what's your takeaway from what we heard today?
I think it's just been fascinating to see how states are kind of approaching this issue in different ways. I mean, I think there's kind of a policy menu that states are often looking at. They're thinking about, deeply affordable housing. They're thinking about homeless shelters and, preventing evictions. And they're thinking about the housing supply. And we kind of see states taking different pieces of that they think are going to really work for them, and advancing legislation along those lines. Another thing I've been because I also cover and think about state budgets a lot, something that's been interesting to me this year is this kind of return from a pandemic era of states just having a ton of money to spend on everything, including housing, to states looking at kind of tighter budgets. And I think Utah's a great example of where lawmakers were thinking, we only have so much surplus cash that we have to spend on new things this year. How can we take this housing priority of the governors and find a way to advance that with a smaller appropriation? And they came up with kind of a creative new financing program, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Yeah, yeah. To your point about states sort of picking and choosing, I thought it was interesting. I mean, the scope of the shortage is different in every state, right? And I remember being out in Sacramento last year talking to lawmakers about housing, and one of the points the speaker made to me was they don't have a housing crisis; they have 5 housing crises. That the Bay Area is different from Los Angeles, which is different from San Diego, and different from the Inland Empire and all that. And they were sort of having to deal with all of those pieces all at once. Let me ask you, we've seen a bunch of other housing bills. We talked a couple of months ago about Colorado's effort, but also Minnesota, New Mexico, Washington, just to name a few of these states. Sort of give us the 30,000-foot view. What are the trends that are developing in multiple states this year?
Oh God, it's so hard to do that because there are just so many states. But I think that, one thing that I've definitely heard about a lot, and this is not new, but this whole idea around accessory dwelling units. How do we legalize them? How do we incentivize them? How do we make it easier for people to put these backyard cottages in their backyard or convert a garage? I think that's kind of, multiple people have said to me, that's kind of like a low-hanging fruit housing policy, zoning reform idea. So we're definitely seeing that. I think as I was saying, sort of continued funding for kind of core housing strategies like trying to keep housing affordable. Some of these zoning ideas are still gaining traction this year. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I haven't been following the Minnesota bill as closely as I should, but I know Arizona passed a big zoning reform law that the governor vetoed. So that was sort of an interesting dynamic there. I think we're going to see continued pressure on that front in the states as lawmakers try to figure out, how can we craft policies that are going to free up some of these local restrictions that are really restraining development. But it's still very controversial. I mean, as we see in Arizona, the governor and the legislature were not on the same side about what had to be done on that at all. We still see a lot of pushback from cities on that, despite, these kind of coalitions that are forming around housing production that I think are really spurred by this sense of crisis.
Yeah, yeah. One sort of along the lines of that ADU push is is this sort of notion of redeveloping buildings from one purpose into housing. Pennsylvania lawmakers just introduced a bill this week that would allow old malls to be redeveloped into affordable housing. Do you think is this the solution to the post-pandemic crisis in commercial real estate?
I don't know. I've talked to some experts about that, and they're sort of, the bottom line is it's really hard to like make a straightforward conversion work, like to take that downtown office building that maybe was built, it was built for like, I don't know, a huge company, or it was purpose-built for medical offices. To retrofit that into apartments is really difficult. I think the mall question is interesting because I think, there are, particularly in some suburban areas, malls that are really struggling. And I think some of the researchers I've talked to would say the solution there is to just like, again, step in with a zoning reform and say, we can build multifamily on this site now, and kind of free up developers to go in and kind of scrape that site and put something new there. Because I think, there are plenty of, malls that are doing well, but there are malls and shopping centers that aren't doing well. And the opportunity to kind of use that land and put something on it that's more valuable to the community and maybe gets at this housing crisis. It just seems like a win-win. The challenge is, I think, making the math work for developers to make those kinds of projects feasible. And there is a mix of zoning reforms and incentives and different strategies that states and cities can use to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, we talked about a lot of that in the conversation that we're about to hear. Thank you, Sophie, for hosting this event and for giving us your perspective on what you're reporting. We really appreciate it. Let's take a minute to hear from our sponsor, the National Association of Home Builders. I spoke yesterday with Alicia Huey, the NAHB's immediate past president. So here she is. I'm happy to welcome in Alicia Huey, immediate past chairman of the National Association of Home Builders, our sponsors for today's event. Alicia, first of all, thank you for bringing us the conversation we just had. I know the National Association of Home Builders has been working on the root of this housing shortage, the lack of supply. Tell us what the National Association of Home Builders has been telling state lawmakers about the best approaches to boosting supply.
When I have the opportunity to speak, I ask them to please let us be a resource to all things housing. If it's zoning, if it's anything that's related to housing, please let us be a resource, because we're going to be the ones to take up the slack in the supply. So have the conversation with us on any changes that they want to make in codes, on zoning, as to how that really affects housing, the affordability and the attainability for everyone. To let us be a resource. We're not the enemy. We really do want to work to bring housing to more people. And we also understand that the issues that the lawmakers are facing, because if there's not housing, then there is no economic development. So it really does go hand in hand, and we can work together.
Yeah. NIMBYism has always been a hurdle to new housing at the local level. How can legislatures take the pressure off city and county officials?
They can be the bad cop and let the city and county officials be the good cop. If they could change legislation where, if there's zoning in place that says that you can build townhomes, then the NIMBYisms can't do anything about that. Sure, we can look at design and maybe the number of units and things like that, but if the legislatures could change that and give the city and county officials more meat to their decisions, would certainly help go a long way in helping with the NIMBYisms.
Yeah, there's a lot more buzz these days around alternative dwelling units. What's the realistic role that these alternative dwelling units play in bringing new supply into the market?
I think that they could be helpful, but they're not going to solve the crisis that we have. I think that some people, I believe, are afraid of them because they look at them as a rental unit in somebody's backyard that who would they rent to? What would the rent be? What would the facility look like? But the reality is that some people want those ADU units to help their family members that may not can afford a house, that can move into some of those units. I personally considered it when I was thinking about the conversation we were going to have today. My mom is getting older, and it's the time that we could sell her house and move her closer to me. She could still have her privacy and feel independent if we had an ADU for her, if it was allowed in my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Every lawmaker I talk to, almost no matter what issue they want to talk about, workforce development is this underlying concern. And I know the same is certainly true for the construction industry. Can you talk about sort of some of the challenges in workforce development that your members are facing?
Oh, absolutely. Our chief economist, Dr. Dietz, shared with us yesterday in our board meeting that we have 441,000 open construction jobs right now. Open construction jobs, 441,000. And I think there's some statistics that say there's probably 22 different trades that get involved in building a house. And I've also heard the number, well, I've never counted everybody that's on my job site during the construction, that there's over 400 people that are hands-on and making, the house become a reality, the house become a home. And we really need some help with that. Recently, we were able to secure funding for Job Corps when they were going to cut Job Corps completely out of the budget. I understand budget constraints and things need to be changed, but when you look at the open rates for jobs and cutting Job Corps funding, that just was not something that was needed or helpful at all for us. We still are going to work to make sure that it's funded completely, but we also face the negative perceptions of the trades too, and we could certainly use some help with that.
Yeah. As you talk with state level lawmakers, what's your message? How can they help alleviate this workforce crisis in the industry?
Many ways. They can help in conversations with parents and with school counselors. That there are some wonderful jobs in the construction industry, wonderful opportunities to be business owners. I mean, when I was of the age in mind with my parents, I was supposed to go to college, and I did for a while, but then I just wasn't for me. I was thought I wanted to be a school teacher, and which is typical. And but I love what I do. It's a wonderful industry, many opportunities, so many different people that you can meet. So if they can help us with those conversations, but then also funding, there are quite a few home builders associations throughout the country. There's a state home builders association and a local home builders association in every state that can help with, and they can help them with funding for programs that they may be doing. I know my local association is putting together workforce training in the trades for plumbing, HVAC, and electrical. I know in North Carolina, they have a semi truck that they travel around to the schools with, and the legislature there has helped them with funding. They're expensive to build, but there's so many opportunities there on the hands-on that the kids can get inside that trailer and learn what they do. I had an opportunity to drive an 18-wheeler in a simulated facility that they had there on the truck. So just things like that. But again, if we can just sit down and have a conversation about all of these things, I think that we could come to a mutual agreement and really help each other.
All right, Alicia Huey, the immediate past chairman of the National Association of Home Builders. Thank you again so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, folks. Thank you all for sticking around, and thanks to both Alicia Huey and the National Association of Home Builders for sponsoring today's event. Thank you, as always, for being a part of the Pluribus News community. We'll have a lot more of these events coming up, so check your inboxes. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the week.